Mississippi River is America's great river, usually flowing peacefully all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, where it delivers more than a cubic kilometer of water every day. But periodically, when conditions are right, the mighty Mississippi flexes its muscles and becomes the angry Mississippi. Owing to its giant drainage basin, it's capable of enormous floods. What exactly is a flood? In the case of a river, a flood is simply where the river escapes its normal channel and the water advances across dry land. A river's channel is located somewhere within the river's floodplain, which is a relatively flat area underlain by river-deposited sediments called alluvium. The floodplain is formed by the river meandering back and forth over time. It's the limits of where the channel has been at one time or another. During a flood, the water rises out of its channel and extends across the floodplain. A very good question at this point is, how often does this happen? For major rivers, graphs have been developed that show the discharge of a river versus how often the river has reached those different levels. For example, suppose a river reaches a discharge of 100 cubic meters per second, and then 40 years pass before it again reaches that same discharge. With that information, one data point may be plotted. Over time, enough data points will allow the fitting of a line. Among other things, it's hoped this line will allow predictions of the discharge necessary to reach the levels of so-called 100 and 500-year floods.
A common misconception is that, for example, the term 100-year flood means that it's a flood you can only have every 100 years. In reality, all it means is that there is a 1% chance of having a flood of that size in any given year. It's entirely possible to have a 100-year flood in each of successive years, or even to have 2 100-year floods in the same year. Finally, this approach assumes that nothing is fundamentally changing, either in the local climate or within that river's drainage basin.
In 1927, the Mississippi unleashed a massive flood. The river broke through levees in 145 places, flooding 70,000 square kilometers. It killed 246 people. The river flooded a whopping 1/7 of the entire state of Arkansas. Near Memphis, the Mississippi reached nearly 100 kilometers wide. That's about 60 miles. At its peak, 1.5 cubic miles of water passed through the river each day. The devastation was so massive, this flood was largely responsible for the future involvement of the federal government in disaster management and recovery, and it forever changed how rivers are managed. In 1993, over a meter of rain, which easily exceeded the typical yearly precipitation, fell over the course of several months in the upper Midwest of the United States. This led to some of the worst flooding ever along the middle stretches of the river. Near St. Louis, where the Missouri River joins the Mississippi, both rivers swelled to many times their normal width. Here, the river was nearly 20 feet above flood stage and reached its highest level in 228 years. Over 1,000 levees failed and nearly 50,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. Damage was estimated at around $15 billion. In some locations, the Mississippi remained above flood stage for more than 6 months. This flood ranks as one of the worst natural disasters ever to strike the United States. Unfortunately, because of widespread media references to the flood as a 100-year or even 500-year event, many people canceled their flood insurance after the flood, assuming they'd be safe for the foreseeable future. Just 15 years after the 1993 flooding, several months of heavy precipitation in the Midwest again led to the flooding of numerous rivers. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, Missouri, and Illinois were especially affected. In Iowa, part of the campus of the University of Iowa was flooded by the Iowa River. In Hannibal, Missouri, the Mississippi flooded a significant part of Mark Twain's hometown. And yes, this church's pastor really is named Boatman, and while his church was protected, his house was unfortunately flooded. In many towns, such as Clarksville, Missouri, homes, businesses, and churches surrounded themselves with sandbags in an effort to stay dry. When an area is sandbagged, that doesn't completely keep the water out, and more or less continuous pumping is necessary. National Guard troops, in particular, played a key role in keeping towns and neighborhoods dry. Some of the most dramatic losses were to crops, especially Iowa's huge corn crop, as floodwaters inundated thousands of acres of fields. Only the wildlife seemed to delight in the opportunities afforded by the vast, if temporary, expanses of shallow water. A large number of homes were submerged in the rising Mississippi. Floating propane tanks presented a fire hazard. Houses in this neighborhood were mostly built on 12-foot stilts to allow for considerable flooding, but only houses built on 16-foot stilts stayed safely above the floodwaters. Many levees in the area were topped by the water by a lot. This turbulence in the river was the only sign that, well below the surface, lay a completely submerged levee. It seemed that everywhere the Mississippi was rising up to touch the land. One of the more heart-wrenching stories occurred in Winfield, Missouri. Weeks of hard work to shore up and protect a levee were undone by a muskrat that burrowed into the soggy, saturated, and weakened levee, triggering a breach that flooded the entire community. The city of St. Louis was mostly spared serious flooding this time around, as it is built on substantially higher ground than many of its smaller neighbors. Flooding lasted for approximately 3 weeks, causing over $6 billion in damage and killing 13 people. Especially in the wake of the 2008 flooding on the Mississippi, geologists are taking a second look at the concept and calibration of 100-year floods and 500-year floods. In one study, it was concluded that near Hannibal, Missouri, what's currently thought to be a 100-year flood is probably more like a 10-year flood. Other studies have concluded that, at present, our historical records of flooding on the Mississippi simply don't go back far enough in order for us to have a clear idea of how common major floods really are.